Come on in. It's our community, and I'm Mary Davidson. And we have a very, well, they're all interesting guests, but this is a particularly interesting guest. His name is Bill Ouseley, and he wrote a book called Open City. And Open City is a historical work detailing and analyzing the birth and growth of the organized crime family in Kansas City during the first 50 years of the 20th century. And it began with the Black Hand, and then we trace it through Prohibition and its alliance with the Pendergast machine and the birth of La Cosa Nostra and the hard times in the 50s. It's the story of Kansas City, its politics, powerful, colorful mob bosses, gangland murders, racket activities, and courageous police officers and reformers. That was a mouthful, Bill. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Oh, it's wonderful. Now, Bill Ouseley, I have to tell you, was an FBI agent for 22 years and knew many of these people, I have to say, quite well, because you really did.
Well, not so many of some of these in the book because of the age, but they're those that came after him I knew very well, yes.
Marcus Aurelius, many, many years ago, said, "Poverty is the mother of crime." What do you think about that?
Well, certainly it's an element and forces many people away from careers legitimate into the, it was one of the things that attracted young Italian boys into the organization, yes, yeah. Poverty.
Well, and between 1820 and 1840, through a very interesting series of events, not the least of which was the potato famine in Ireland, many, many, many Irish came to America, and many came to Kansas City, and they settled in the West Bottoms. Down there, well, in those days there were bluffs, so they settled down below the bluffs, and they lived in poverty and in filth, and they were hard laborers. They didn't have an education and not many skills. Therefore,
well, they formed the basis of what is one of the two major elements in the story, the mob and politics, and these people formed the basis of a political base for Big Jim Pendergast when he came from St. Joe and settled below the bluffs and became the padrone of the neighborhood. People came to him.
The saloon, and he was in the saloon business, so a lot so a lot of people came to him for a variety of reasons.
Right, he was the community center.
That's right. So to set the stage again, now we have the Irish coming between 1820, 1840, 1850. They kept coming. And around in the late 1800s, then we began to have the influx of Italians. And they came to Kansas City and settled in the North End. They were a little different type. They were more religious, hardworking kinds of people, but they faced what many of us have faced in this country is discrimination. And the signs were up. No Italians allowed. Italians need not apply. And so many of their children had to drop out of school to get jobs to support the family. Here comes the backlash, and talk about that a little bit.
Well, yes, they were different in that they did not speak the language as the Irish did. Many of them were English speaking, but that contributed to it, and part of it was their own clannishness. All ethnic groups like to settle together for comfort, and they created a little Italy, and they, in a sense, confined themselves to the North End. But in amongst these mainly hardworking, industrious, God-fearing people who escaped for a better life were elements of the mafia, of Sicily, predators, and other criminal people. And
they brought with them that protocol.
That's what they knew best. They lived with it because in Sicily, the mafia is the government. The mafia controls everything. You don't go outside the mafia. The mafia don is your mayor. He's your facilitator. He is the one that gets things done.
The Godfather.
The Godfather, right. So that's exactly what he was, and the way he wanted to portray himself. He took care of his people, supposedly, while he extorted them.
Was it difficult for them to get these urban gangs we're talking now about the mafia and the Black Hand. Was it difficult to get them organized in the North End?
Oh yeah, in the beginning there was no organization. There were cliques, groups, individuals. There was no, as I like to tell people, there was no transplanting of a mafia group from Sicily here, and they just started business. These were individuals, a lot of times tied to the city they came from. And so there was no organization in the Black Hand era.
You talk about, quite often, you talk about Niccolo Gentile.
Gentile, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And he had a lot to say.
Yeah.
Because he wrote
Because
things.
he wrote his story.
And what did he say about these clan, gangs, urban criminals? Did he?
Well, one of the things that Gentile tells us is the uniformity of development around the country.
And that's important.
It is, because that came together later.
Yeah.
But this same dynamic happened in all major cities. The Sicilian groups, Little Italy, Black Hand, and what have you. So, and he, as a traveling diplomat for this burgeoning organization.
A circuit rider.
Exactly, yeah. Was able to give us that flavor that even though lack of communication, no television and cell phones and no easy you don't jump on a jet, there was still connections between these people that later would develop into the syndicate.
Would you go so far as to say that Niccolo Gentile was important in coalescing and organizing these gangs? Well,
he played that role. Yeah, he played that role, and in a regard, it was a form of glue, because when Niccolo came into town, you knew he represented even bigger people. And he was there because you respected him and were going to abide by his rulings. So there was a cohesiveness brought together by his presence.
See, I think that's very interesting, because something had to happen, or somebody had to emerge to make these gangs coalesce so that they could operate as they did later as a huge business.
Well, he contributed to that. He talks about the fact that even in that early day, the main brunt of these people were in the East Coast, in New York. Mm-hmm. And he talks about a form of a commission that existed, that people recognized and respected. And so as a representative of that group, it greased the skids for what would to come later.
And I think we need to pull out that thread that people knew about and respected, because that's where they came from. Mm-hmm. So the general population, the hard workers and the people committed to their religion and all these, they didn't have any problem with it because that's what they knew.
Well, that's true.
So they didn't have any pushback.
Well, yeah. There was two elements there. One is that their heritage is, the Southern Italians, was that because the mafia was the ruling class, you abided by the fact that you never went outside that. So any legal authority was suspect. So you never went outside that for two reasons. One, because they had been drilled that these people are not here to help you, we are. And number two, if you do go outside, something will happen.
Bad.
Bad. Very bad.
That's right. Well, you know, all this, we have to lay this groundwork, and it's kind of in a patchwork right now. But crime ratcheted up, it occurs to me, with the Sugar House Gang.
That's right.
So let's talk about the Sugar House Gang, because I think even though they're not nice people and they don't do good things, it's an interesting progression of crime. So the Sugar House Gang is in place, and what do they do?
Well, Prohibition, first of all, you have to look to Prohibition as a law that was well-meaning but actually created organized crime. They couldn't have written a better bill.
But the Sugar House Gang was in business before Prohibition, were they not?
Not so much. I mean, there had always been an element of home brew, so to speak.
Yeah.
And sugar being a main ingredient, exactly. There were people that opened sugar houses. In fact, Scarface Joe DiGiovanni got his name for having burned down one. And
didn't get out quite in time.
Yeah. So there was the element of that, but of course with Prohibition,
that was the opportunity.
Now they got into it full time.
The Volstead Act
Right.
put them in business.
In business. And what happened was, because they were factionalized and fighting each other, the economics of let's work together came into play, and they finally realized that if we consolidate, we can do better. And because we're all brothers here, why do we compete? And they formed the various sugar houses that were operated by major people who would be major people.
Did we have one in Kansas City?
This was a Kansas City phenomenon.
Okay.
I mean,
so
there
it
was
spread out from Kansas City? No, or
well,
stayed here?
It bootlegging was, of course,
big business.
Big business in every city.
Yeah.
And it took different forms. Here, it was this sugar house.
Okay.
And it was the element that brought them together, and that, you could say, was the birth of the crime family. Now they're all together.
And now let's go back a minute, and we have Niccolo Gentile, and he was the circuit rider, and he began the operation. The Sugar House gang saw their opportunity with Prohibition, and that really coalesced their operation
in Kansas City.
In Kansas City. So we're moving down the wire here, and the plot is thickening because with the entry of the political machine, you remember Jimmy Durante, and he said everybody wants to get into the act.
Yeah.
And so with the political machine, then they began to take a look at the Sugar House gang, and now the Irish are going to get into it.
Well, you have to go back a little bit to the step back to Big Jim Pendergast, really, to set the stage for that. In that the dynamic in the United States, just not here, in that era of the robber barons and what have you, was the political machine relied on the criminal element. They worked together. They got the vote out any way they could. Didn't matter how they did it. Just get us the vote, and we'll protect your operations. This was the Tammany Hall of New York, Boss Tweed, all of these major people did the same thing. Jim Pendergast never met a gambler he didn't like. So he began, that dynamic began here. And that kept him in office, and he, in turn, protected the criminal element. Now, you have to jump.
But we do translate this as votes, and votes are
votes.
Power. And votes are power.
That's the whole thing.
Okay.
That's what gave him it. He had the Irish bloc. Now all he needed was to make sure it was cemented, and as he moved out, he needed these people. Now, they had the North End under their machinery, the Pendergast people. So when they needed people to ensure the Italian vote, who did they turn to? To the mafia types. So that partnership was brewing before Prohibition. And so this alliance has been part of this story forever.
But enter John Lazzia.
Right.
And John Lazzia said, hey, I don't want the Irish coming into the North End and making business on my home turf.
Right.
So it was very important. That was a very important position that John Lazzia took.
Well, it's part of their culture to recognize the importance of control, and politics is a way to control. And this was just part of their being, you know, that they needed to be, they needed to have the clout. And as you described, he said, why should the Irish be down here? This is our block of vote, and with that block of vote, we have power. And so he took over the North End.
And money and power are really a combination.
Exactly, and especially the alliance that came out of that with Pendergast.
Well, John Lazzia is kind of an interesting person because he got his start before 1920.
Yep.
In the record, so he came up kind of the hard way, as opposed to Lucky Luciano, who was the child of immigrants but born in this country. So he was sort of the second generation of criminals and gangsters, if you were. But you know, always lurking in the background is the IRS.
No.
The IRS, the Internal Revenue.
Well, sure. They were the main, yeah. There were no laws. You have to recognize organized crime was hardly even, wasn't even accepted or recognized until Prohibition, and then it was looked on as guys and dolls. This will pass. But there were no laws. There were no laws directed at organized crime. The Internal Revenue Service were the only people that had a way in.
Tax evasion.
Taxing.
Yeah. John Lazia made a deal. Well, now we have to step back a minute. The Missouri Supreme Court decreed that there should be home rule for the police department.
Right.
And John Lazia saw that as a real opportunity, as did the politicians as well. And you have a letter in your book. And I think this gives us somewhat of an idea. This is to Mr. Pendergast, and it's signed by Mr. Navina from the 13th Ward. He's probably the ward healer in the 13th Ward. And a copy goes to John Lazia and a copy to Jim Pendergast. And he says the bearer, Mr. R.R. Kramer, 3722 Wabash, has lived in the 13th Ward for about 2 years and has the recommendation of Mr. O.H. Phillips, his precinct captain. I mean, see, all of these people are on the take. I know this boy's father, who is connected with the Jenkins Music Company, located in Wichita, Kansas. If possible, I would appreciate the favor if you could place this young man somewhere, thanking you for past favors. And there you go.
Well, the home rule handed the police department to the Unholy Alliance. John Lazio sat in the chief's office, answered the phone there, hired ex-felons, put the police department to work for the mob, and to protect the vice lords. That was when Open City came to be. And this was an example of a letter looking for a job that Lazia signed off on.
But without his signature, it would not have happened.
Probably not. No. And so it was an indicator of the power that existed that made this a captive city.
And all the parts now are coming together to make this crime business really very well organized, very profitable, and overwhelming, really, when you stop and think about it. The size and the scope is...
Absolutely. Everybody paid. If you wanted a job at City Hall, you paid. If you wanted to run a bookmaking operation, you paid. You wanted to run a house of ill repute, you paid. The girls who worked there, they paid. Bar owners, they paid. Everybody kicked in. They called it the lug. In order to operate, you paid. This enormous wealth, this was shared with Pendergast. And it promoted his activities, his politics, and the mob's growth.
Well, and when we talk about politicians, I think we have to re-enter with a politician, James A. Reed.
Yeah.
And when Nell Donnelly was kidnapped, and Jim Reed and Nell Donnelly were an item. So he went to John Lazio and he said, "You better find her or I will."
Well, he said, I'll ruin you.
Yeah.
I'll ruin you. You'll... And to Lazio's credit, he put his boys out on the street, and they found.
And back she came. Back she came.
Right. The only thing they didn't do is bring her in. They said, "Here's where you find her. That's as far as we'll work with the chief."
The next person that I think we need to bring into the play is Charles Carollo. What about him?
Well, Charles Carollo started out, as so many of them do, the career path in the mob is being chauffeur. If you're a chauffeur, you're probably going to be the next in line. And I could name you right down the line. That's how Nick Savella got his and the people in Chicago. But Carollo was a boyhood friend of Lazia. He was with him all the time.
Trusted. He was trusted.
Yes. He was his almost like blood. And he drove him, he bodyguarded him, he was his main man, So everywhere Lazia went, all the people that Lazia knew, all the stops that had to be collected, Carolla was a part of it. So when Lazia was murdered, Carolla was the logical guy
Step right
to
in.
put out front.
But we do need to remember that Prohibition is still in force now, so because we don't want to drop that thread, because
Yep.
Prohibition was feeding the kitty.
Oh yes.
Big
Oh,
time.
that made them
Big time.
wealthy beyond.
Well, now let's talk a little bit. There's another piece to this puzzle, and that's the jazz musicians. Down in 1930. Now, in 1930, John Lazia is still going strong.
Oh sure.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Now-
It's the height of it.
Yeah. So how about the jazz district? Because that was big time stuff
Sure.
in Kansas City.
Well, you have to look at the whole situation. You had the Wall Street demise, so there was no money. Who had the money? The mob. They had all the cash you could have possibly imagined. So Prohibition is going on, and speakeasies start to develop. First, you have a piano player, then a dance floor, then three-piece orchestra, each one competing. And as they want to compete and upgrade, they need money. They need the infusion of investment money. Who is there to get that money from?
Surprise.
The banks ain't loaning. You can't get it. So there's the mob. They come in. They are the hidden owners, and that was their all around the country too. Their foothold into the entertainment industry and the jazz scene in Kansas City.
Fascinating. But after Prohibition, as you say in your book, the beat goes on.
Well, sure. There, one thing you have to remember: one of the cultures they brought from the old country is we're here forever.
We're going nowhere.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we plan on being here for. In fact, we plan on eventually being stronger than everybody else, even your government. It wasn't going to work here, but that's how it was in Sicily. So it wasn't a matter that Prohibition ended and they're gone away. What happened was, with Prohibition over and the wildness of that era, people thought they may have gone away. There was less killing, less conflict. They moved into more sophisticated areas of labor racketeering, gambling. They upgraded gambling. They moved into drugs heavier than they had been. So their outward appearance of the bodies in the street all the time and all may have changed, but they were simply operating on a different scale. They had to replace Prohibition with something else.
Well, and I think it's appropriate to say here that for good or evil, these were not dumb people.
Oh.
And they were bright men who created a very successable business and could have run any big corporation.
Well, you know, I'd have to agree with that, and they have a animal street sense about things. They size up people as well as you could imagine. So you wonder sometimes how far they could have gone.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
Let's talk just a little bit about the Kefauver Committee, because they threw a monkey wrench into the smooth running of the business.
Well, they sure did, and it's an interesting story because again, politics plays into it. The killing of the two Charlies, I call them, Bonaggio and Gargata, in 1950, that came before the Kefauver Committee, and a particularly fraudulent election where they blew the doors off the courthouse safe and stole all of the ballots here, were two of the elements that raised the political criminal image in Washington and led to a push for something to be done. At the same time, Truman, being tied to Pendergast and the political machine, was against it. Yeah. He didn't want to embarrass his people.
But the inertia was there, and it went on with or without him.
Yeah, because his people told him, if we ignore this, it'll be worse. So they formed this committee headed by Tennessee Senator Kefauver, and his task was to find out what is this thing in organized crime in America?
Because I think the Americans were somewhat oblivious to
Sure.
the size. But Rabbi Mehrberg was not. Samuel Mehrberg in Kansas City.
Yes.
He took out after the organized crime here.
Well, there was always a reform element in Kansas City. The rabbi was one of the vocal people and paid for it. They shut up his car and he had to take care of that. But there was always and it was underground because they would be harassed and intimidated. They didn't come to play until 1940 election after Pendergast went to jail and Corolla went to jail. Finally, the reform movement surfaced and won, and the 40s became the reform era.
If you want to read more about it, Rabbi Mehrberg wrote a very interesting book called Chronicles of an American Crusader that you might find interesting.
He was quite a person.
Where are we now with crime? You've been, you were with the FBI 22 years. You saw a lot of these, Tony Savella and Willie the Rat Comisano.
Mm-hmm.
Those are your people.
Well, they were the next in line. They inherited what came out of this group. Many of them. Well, what happened, just very, very briefly, is the tide turned in 1957 when they all met. Oh, I shouldn't say all, but there was a Cosa Nostra that came into effect in 1931 is when they all joined Cosa Nostra. And in 1957, the board of directors met in this little town of Appalachian, New York. With the breakup of that organization, all the heads had to come out of the sand. And they had to say, you know, really there's something we need to do about this. Kefauver did a great job and nothing happened. Politics again stifled any move to legislate. Now it was out of the bag. They came out of the closet. We're going to have to act. That was the beginning of the organized crime drive by the Bureau, by the FBI, by the Department of Justice, by IRS, where
they coalesced as well.
Coalesced.
They did. Yeah.
Yeah. You had your people in education. You had people in media. You had all these people now saying, what is this about, and let's look at it. And I joined the program early on and saw it through to the end of the Savella regime. And the program took that long to see results because it took time to get the laws on the books and give us the tools.
Is a crime family, is it still?
Well, I'm not as much in the loop anymore, to tell you the truth, but from just what I hear and what I see or don't see in the paper, there's the element, or there's some of the young people who are wannabes, I would call them, don't have the power anymore.
They don't have those connections.
No Teamsters, no politics, no anything. And there was recently an indictment of a number of them in a gambling case, some of the old names, but they're simply not a influence.
Well, as I say, thank you, Bill Ouseley. It was most interesting. I would ask you, could it be that the crime problem that we have today and that we have had in the past is in part an overdue debt that the country must pay for ignoring for decades the conditions that breed lawlessness? So it's up to us to be vigilant as well. And I want to say that it's been so nice to have you with us, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Bill.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time. And remember, it's our community, and I'm Mary Davidson. See you again.